Sankofa Square, formerly known as Young Dundas Square, is a 1-acre outdoor public space in the heart of Toronto's downtown core, in the southeast corner of the busiest intersection in Canada. Over 150,000 people pass by daily, not knowing that only a few blocks away, surrounded by new construction and high-rises, is a 3-story brick house that was once the home of a writer, publisher, politician, and rebel. It is now a museum that interprets urban Victorian life of the 1860s and the evolution of democratic institutions through the lens of one of Canada's most influential figures. The house became a museum in the 1950s, and ever since then, it is widely considered to be one of the most haunted buildings in Toronto, thanks to stories from the living caretakers.
And she said when she opened her eyes, there was a lady bending over the bed looking at her with long dark hair and a pale, narrow face. And then she said the lady vanished. And then a few weeks later, she said the same thing happened again. She felt a tap on the shoulder. Lady was there looking over the bed. But this time, Mrs. Edmonds claimed that the lady drew back her hand and slapped her in the face before vanishing. So it was this element that got it into the media.
I'm Nadine Bailey, and this is Haunted Canada. Today, we're visiting the final home of William Lyon Mackenzie, who died in his bedroom on the 2nd floor of 2 Bond Street. This is the story of the Mackenzie house. William Lyon Mackenzie was born into the Mackenzie clan on March 12, 1795, in Dundee, Scotland. Both of his grandparents had fought for Charles Edward Stuart at the Battle of Culloden. If you're a fan of the book series and TV show Outlander, this may sound very familiar. The Mackenzies of Leoch were a fictional Scottish clan whose seat at Castle Leoch were abandoned, and the clan dispersed after the failed Jacobite Rising of 1745. This is similar to the Mackenzies in our story. William's mother, Elizabeth Chambers, born Mackenzie, was a weaver and goat herder that was orphaned at a young age. His father, Daniel Mackenzie, was also a weaver, but was 17 years younger than Elizabeth. The couple married on May 8, 1794, but less than a year later, they attended a public dance, and soon after, Daniel became sick, blind, and bedridden. He died a few weeks later, after William was born. Elizabeth raised William by herself and in the Presbyterian Church. Years later, William would say he was raised in poverty, but the extent of his family's wealth has been mostly lost to history. We do know that at 5 years old, he received a bursary for a parish grammar school in Dundee, and by the time he was 11, he used the reading room of the Dundee Advertiser newspaper, where he documented and summarized the 957 books he read. By the time he was 16 years old, he became a founding member of a club for scientific discussion known as the Dundee Rational Institution. Then, 2 years later, in 1813, 18-year-old William moved to Elith, Scotland, to help his mother open a general store. In Elith, he met Elizabeth Reed, who birthed his child out of wedlock on July 17, 1814. The couple named him James, and after, William endured public criticism for fathering an illegitimate child, he was forced to pay a fine of 13 shillings and 4 pence to the church, equivalent to £59 in 2023. Meanwhile, his family's general store struggled after the recession that followed the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, and it went bankrupt, so William moved to southern England to work as a bookkeeper for the Kennet and Avon Canal Company. he became a gambler and spent most of his money on wild behavior. With his future uncertain, a friend of his, John Leslie, suggested they immigrate to Canada in search for better opportunities. In 1820, the two men boarded a schooner named Psyche and crossed the ocean to arrive in North America, where William soon found work in Montreal for the owners of the Lachine Canal as a bookkeeper and the Montreal Herald as a journalist. Later that year, he moved to York, Upper Canada, where the Leslie family employed him at their business, while he wrote articles for the York Observer under the pseudonym Mercator. The Leslies opened a second shop in Dundas, Upper Canada, and William moved once again so he could manage the store. In 1822, William's mother and son joined William in Upper Canada. Elizabeth invited Isabel Baxter to immigrate with them. Elizabeth had chosen Isabel as William's new bride. The couple had been schoolmates, but really had no interaction prior to her arrival in Upper Canada. They married in Montreal on July 1, 1822, and went on to have 13 children. Their daughter, Elizabeth Grace Mackenzie, would become the mother of Canada's longest-serving Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King. Danielle Urquhart is the program officer at Mackenzie House Museum. She says that long before that happened, William became a key figure in Canadian politics, and it all began while working as a journalist and soon became a political voice through his publication, The Colonial Advocate.
Well, Mackenzie had come over to Toronto from Scotland, and he started a newspaper which criticized the colonial government. He did not like kings or queens, and he did not want to be part of the British Empire. So he was controversial right away. There were attacks on his printing press and attempts to shut him down because the government, or as he called them, the Family Compact, did not like being criticized at that time.
The Family Compact was a small, closed group of men who exercised most of the political, economic, and judicial power in Upper Canada from the 1810s to the 1840s. They were known for conservatism and opposition to democracy. William was elected a York County representative to the Legislative Assembly in 1827, and then York became the City of Toronto in 1834. William was elected its first mayor, and he continued to agitate for reform by using both political and journalistic platforms. By the time he lost his re-election for the Legislative Assembly in 1836, Danielle says that William became convinced that reform could only happen through armed conflict.
Now, he used the controversy over his newspaper to get elected to Parliament, and then he became the first mayor of Toronto in 1834. But what he's most famous for, perhaps, is leading the Rebellion of 1837. Now, we call this the Rebellion rather than the Revolution of 1837 because ultimately it was not successful, but he was trying to actually overthrow British rule in Ontario.
In December 1837, William led the Upper Canadian Rebellion, which was an armed uprising against the colonial government. Danielle says it failed soon after, and William fled to the U.S., where he was forced to live in exile, mostly in New York State, until 1849.
It was not successful, as I mentioned. It ended up as a 20-minute battle in the neighborhood of Yonge and Eglinton streets in modern Toronto, and he had to flee the country or he would have been hanged. Two of his close friends, Sam Lount and Peter Matthews, were hanged at Courthouse Square in Toronto, and other people as well in southern Ontario and even some in Quebec, because this was quite a widespread movement against colonialism at the time. Mackenzie successfully fled to New York.
During this time, however, William became imprisoned in the U.S. for violating neutrality laws because William had recruited members, established an army, and stole weapons for an invasion. Through it all, he continued to publish stories and advocate for Canadian reform. He encouraged friends and readers of his newspaper to petition President Martin Van Buren for a pardon, which would release him from prison. Over 300,000 people signed the petitions that were circulated in New York State, Michigan, and Ohio, and Democrats submitted them to the United States Congress calling for William's release. Van Buren believed it was politically easier to release him from prison than explain his imprisonment. So, on May 10, 1840, Van Buren granted William a pardon. After a summer hiatus, William's newspaper, the Gazette, denounced all invasions into Canada and supported Van Buren's re-election, but the paper's subscriptions were in decline, and the last issue was published on December 23, 1840. William wouldn't be quiet for long, and in April, he launched the Rochester Volunteer and printed articles criticizing Canadian Tory legislatures. But by September 1841, the newspaper was not profitable or politically influential, and William stopped publishing it. He moved back to New York City in June 1842, where he worked for several publishers, but refused to accept a job as an editor. He became an American citizen in April 1843, and less than a year later, he published The Sons of the Emerald Isle, a biography of 500 Irish patriots to remind Americans that their ancestors were also immigrants. That same year, William attended the founding meeting of the National Reform Association in February 1844. Its goal was to distribute public lands to people who lived on the property, limit the amount of land an individual could own, and outlaw the confiscation of free homesteads given to settlers. In October 1845, William published the second volume of The Sons of the Emerald Isle, and Horatio Greenlee hired him to go to Albany, New York, to report on the New York State Constitutional Convention for the New York Tribune. He continued to work for the Tribune until his resignation in April 1848. Meanwhile, Canada was going through reforms, and William was key to those changes. After the Upper Canada Rebellion, British colonial officials sent Lord Durham to investigate its causes. Durham sent an agent to interview William, who said that his grievance against the Upper Canadian government was the composition of the Legislative Council and his desire, quote, to lift the hand of tyranny from the soil, end quote. The Durham report was presented to the British government and recommended that Upper and Lower Canada be merged into the province of Canada. That occurred in 1840, the same year William was pardoned in the U.S. After the 1848 election, reformers held a majority of seats in the Legislative Assembly just as revolutionary movements were spreading in Europe, including one for an independent Ireland. Lord Elgin, the Governor-General of the Province of Canada and the British monarch's representative to the colony, was concerned that Canadians would become disloyal to the British Crown. Danielle says that although William had been pardoned in the U.S., his return to Canada was dangerous.
He couldn't return because there was a 1,000-pound price on his head, and he would have been hanged. However, in 1849, things had begun to change somewhat, and Queen Victoria issued a blanket amnesty for the remaining rebels who were in exile, and Mackenzie was allowed to return. When he came back, there were riots because some people felt, no, he should be in prison, he should be in jail, or he should have been hanged.
This general amnesty bill passed in the Canadian legislature in 1849. William traveled to Montreal in February, and his arrival caused his effigy to be burned in Kingston and riots in Belleville and Toronto. He returned to New York on April 4th and documented his visit as a winter's journey through the Canadas. William didn't move back to Toronto with his family until May 1850. During this time, he wrote weekly articles for the Tribune and contributed to the Examiner and the Niagara Mail. Less than a year after his return to Canada, William re-entered politics. In February 1851, David Thompson, the representative for Haldimand County in the Parliament of Canada, died, and William won the subsequent by-election. He served in the Legislative Assembly of the Province of Canada from 1851 to 1858 and supported moderate reforms and bolstered his ideas through his own newspaper, which he began publishing on December 25, 1852, called Mackenzie's Weekly Message. He later renamed it the Toronto Weekly Message. In 1855, his health began to deteriorate, and in February, he closed the Toronto Weekly Message, and by August 16, 1858, he resigned his seat, calling the legislature illegitimate after the Governor-General reinstated the Macdonald-Cartier administration without an election. At the time, William was in poor health and struggling financially after years of political and journalistic activism, so his friends and political supporters provided him with a permanent residence, a house located at 82 Bond Street. It would become known as Mackenzie House. Danielle says the 3-story brick home, built in a Greek Revival style, was purchased for $3,550.
So it's a narrow box-like house. There are 3 stories and what's called an English basement, where it's kind of like a half basement. And then there's also a modern addition with gallery space. We currently have a wonderful exhibit that spans all our City of Toronto museums called the Home Exhibit. And these exhibits look at what does home mean to people in different contexts. So different at all the sites and all lots of fun to visit. And also in that space, we have our print shop with the 1845 press.
William and his family moved into the home in 1859. The kitchen and the day room were on the ground floor, as they were the coolest spots during the hot summer days, and became a favorite location where the family spent most of their time. The second floor had a living room, a den with a piano. The third floor is where the primary bedroom is located. It faces Bond Street, and there are 2 other bedrooms on this floor as well. Those were for William's 3 daughters, which they shared. Danielle also mentioned a printing press from 1845 that was held in a box room where William kept all of his supplies. She says the family only lived in the house for 2 years because William Mackenzie sadly passed away in his bedroom on August 28, 1861, and soon after, his family had to make tough financial choices.
So after Mackenzie dies, his wife and his daughters live on there for a bit. But because they need money, they did a smart thing. They moved out and sublet the house to get rental income and earn some money that way. And then after his wife Isabel had passed away, the children ultimately sold the house, and it was divided into a rooming house. So for about 50 years, it was used as a rental property. And so all kinds of interesting people were coming and going. There were journalists living there for a while, medical students, and that continued up until the 1930s, when a gentleman called Wilbur Best bought the house with his own money and donated it to the City of Toronto to make a museum. And the connection was he was a printer, so he admired Mackenzie's newspaper. And that's how it became a City of Toronto museum.
The house became a museum in the 1950s. Danielle said that 5 different married couples lived in the Mackenzie house over the years, as well as caretakers.
And the only condition is they have to open the door to visitors during opening hours. So of those 5 sets of caretakers, 3 had no problems whatsoever, seemed to have enjoyed living there, and just went on their way. So the two couples that claimed to have had ghostly experiences at the house were Mr. and Mrs. Charles Edmonds and Mr. and Mrs. Alex Dobbin. The Dobbins claimed that they heard noises. They said they heard footsteps on the stairs, bangs, thumps around the house. They didn't like it, and so they moved out.
The story by Mrs. Edmond made newspaper headlines in the day.
The Edmonds also claimed to have heard some noises, but they also have claimed to have seen the ghost of Mackenzie walking down the front walk, a man in a frock coat walking onto Bond Street. They claimed to have seen the same ghost in the bedroom. And Mrs. Edmonds also had the most dramatic claim, which is the one that has, I guess, put the story on the ghost map. She said that one night that when she was asleep in her bed, she was awakened by a little tap on the shoulder. And she said when she opened her eyes, there was a lady bending over the bed looking at her with long dark hair and a pale, narrow face. And then she said the lady vanished. And then a few weeks later, she said the same thing happened again. She felt a tap on the shoulder. Lady was there looking over the bed. But this time, Mrs. Edmonds claimed that the lady drew back her hand and slapped her in the face before vanishing. So it was this element that got it into the media.
Tales of encounters of paranormal activity in the house are common. There are reports of footsteps, creaking on the stairs, and the sounds of the parlor's piano being played when no one's there. Multiple accounts have a small, bald man in a wig and a frock coat lurking around the home, and the printing press in the basement has been known to operate on its own late in the night. These seem to be associated with William's days as a journalist. When the house was donated to the City of Toronto in 1960, an inventory was done, and it included one ghost. Anglican Archdeacon John Frank was called in to perform a blessing that some believe was in fact an exorcism. Danielle said CBC covered the story.
The CBC did a famous special, and you can still view the footage at the National Archives in Ottawa, but the CBC did a whole special on ghosts in Toronto, and that's why a lot of folks who are now in their 70s and 80s remember watching that back in 1960 and being scared by it. So they interviewed some of the Edmonds family. But the other element they included was a cleansing, a spiritual cleansing. So a deacon from Trinity Church in Toronto walked through the house and said prayers in every room. And there's always been speculation, I wouldn't say myself, but regarding the ghost stories, some folks have always wondered, was it a publicity gimmick? And if so, it's certainly one of the most successful ones in Canada history, because all these years later, people are still super intrigued. So some people say, I would say, but I have met the Edmonds grandchildren. So there was a grandson who used to come and stay in the house, and he said to me, no, his grandparents genuinely believed.
Today, hundreds of people visit the Mackenzie Museum every week to learn a bit about Canada's history, while many others venture inside to learn about the ghosts and spirits that roam the halls.
Well, nowadays most people come with an awareness because one way that we get visitors is there's a tour company here called Haunted Toronto Walks. And they're quite a good resource for us because they do outdoor tours, and then they suggest that people come by and visit the museum. So that's very nice for us. So the people go by on a tour at night and hear a bit about ghost stories, and then they come to see the museum and hear a bit about history and make a newspaper on our historic press. So they get to have the full experience. So yeah, I think, and of course, I started working in 2000 before everybody was regularly on the internet. So we've seen a bit of an evolution in how people access content. So nowadays we also get the influencers and the YouTubers and that kind of thing who are also quite interested in asking these kind of questions. So yeah, it's a broad scope of people who take an interest.
Danielle says that staff welcomes both believers and skeptics.
Our feeling is that anything that brings people to a museum is a good thing. So whatever reason that brings you through the door. Like I said, I've worked there for 25 years, and I've even sometimes stayed overnight for Nuit Blanche, and I've never seen anything. So I would pronounce myself on the skeptical side of things, but we're perfectly happy to talk about the folklore of the house with visitors, and if visitors want to share their experience, we like that too. So yeah, any interest that brings people.
While Danielle hasn't experienced anything supernatural firsthand, it doesn't mean others haven't. She knows that staff have heard footsteps on the staircase and creaks in the old wooden floors when there's nobody else around. They have also heard the piano playing on its own from the living room, but when they enter, the music stops. William's printing press, where he published his newspaper, is very popular with visitors. Staff will guide them as they experience typesetting, rolling the black ink out, and manually printing a copy of the paper. But when visitors leave, staff will often hear the sound of the printing press operating on its own. In 2018, Bruce Beaton, a historical interpreter at Mackenzie House, gave Global News a tour of the home.
Remember, William Lyon Mackenzie was a journalist. He had a newspaper called the Colonial Advocate. The printing press behind me, in the past, has been known to operate of its own volition late at night. The sounds of people walking up and down the stairs here. It's a creaky old house, so anybody walking up and down that stairs will be noticed. Apparently, some nights, the piano plays on its own.
Much like Danielle, he has never encountered paranormal activity himself, but knows that others have had many ghostly encounters in the museum that showcases a spine-tingling piece of Toronto's history.
Well, Toronto has this wonderful collection of museums, of which we are just one. So Mackenzie House is one piece of a story that spans 10 City of Toronto museums. And apart from an interest, I guess, in ghost stories, if people are interested in historic media and newspapers and the technology, it's kind of a unique experience to be able to operate an 1840s printing press.
So the next time you find yourself in Canada's busiest intersections, make sure you venture east by a couple of blocks to visit one of Toronto's most haunted locations. Just make sure to bring a steady nerve, because you never know who or what might be lurking beside you. Thank you for joining on this visit to Mackenzie House, and a special thank you to Danielle Urquhart for all her help with this episode. Haunted Canada is sponsored by the Edmonton Ghost Tours. I will link it in the show notes. Haunted Canada is written and produced by me, Nadine Bailey, with senior producer, Dila Velasquez. Production and sound design is by Rob Johnston, with help from Rosin Kufer. If you would like to learn more about Mackenzie House, please visit the website toronto.ca. If you would like to support this podcast, please follow and share, and if you can give us a like and a 5-star written review, that is always appreciated. Also, you can follow me on our different social media platforms, or if you have a ghost story, haunting, or true crime that you would like for us to cover on this podcast, please email me through the website hauntedcanada.com. And a big thank you to everyone who has sent emails letting me know how much you're enjoying this podcast, and for sending me your own ghost stories and hauntings to cover on this podcast. I really do appreciate it. Thank you from all of us at Haunted Canada and Curious Cast. Have a good night, everyone, and stay haunted.